Hello, and welcome back to Tales of Faith, a podcast on the narrative lectionary. We are on narrative lectionary 304, Exodus 12, 1 through 13, and 13, 1 through 8 for September 29th, 2024. I am with my beautiful co-host once again, Louise.
Hello.
And yeah, welcome back. Any thoughts about Joseph before we dive into?
Um, no, I mean with the kids we talked a little bit about, making poor choices and lies that heap upon lies and forgiving, recognizing when forgiveness is given and not only giving forgiveness but also learning how to accept forgiveness. Um, so those were the things I tried to point out.
Mhm.
Apparently, what really stood out to the children, though, was the Joseph's coat getting dipped in blood. So,
Yeah.
that was the
Fun to
big,
see what what people fixate on. All
yeah.
right. So where we are now, we've gone beyond the book of Genesis, and we are now in the book of Exodus. And so Joseph's family is brought down to Egypt for the period of time that the famine is that goes on. But now they are there, and they have been there for quite a while and have grown numerous. So the sort of the blessing of Abraham that they be this great people um, has come about. And yeah, but then there's a change of leadership, and a pharaoh comes into power who knows nothing about Joseph. And so there's just this big group of people in his land, and so chooses to try to keep them under control, worried about an uprising that they would join Egypt's enemies. And so multiple step plan. First, there's sort of a um, trying to sort of quietly kill specifically the males so that they're not quite as aggressive and can't procreate quite as quickly. That doesn't help. He then enslaves them, and that doesn't seem to stop their numbers at all. Then makes it a much more public genocide where they're actively killing any of the boys who are born of the Hebrews. There's a conspiracy to bring in these wonderful people that help out with
Midwives.
midwives. There you go, Shifra and Pua. And they do not participate the way that they are expected to. A child is born. Moses goes away. Well, is raised in Pharaoh's household. Is a murderer and runs away, and has now come back because God has called Moses to free his people. Tried to speak with Pharaoh to get them liberated, and Pharaoh does not want to participate in that. And we've now gone through basically most of the strikes, the sort of this plagues, these sort of signs is the word that is used primarily in the book of Exodus for these things, sort of amazing things that happen. It's very much about the power of Adonai over and against Pharaoh and the gods of the Egyptians. And so now we're at the last of those. We've kind of gone back and forth. There's been sort of a request to go, take the Hebrews out to worship God in the wilderness. Pharaoh doesn't accept this. will sometimes accept it and then go back after the sign is taken away, stuff like that. So that was a real quick up sort of
Yeah, we're
zip
going through a
through.
lot.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Basically, the bulk of what we understand as the Exodus story is what we're kind of summing up here. Um, any thoughts? Anything that you think is important that we should mention about this story?
No, I mean I think that's the highlights or lowlights or however you want to look at those things.
If you want to, you can always check out Cecil B. DeMille's or Prince of Egypt, which, in my opinion, is the far superior version. I haven't actually seen Exodus. Who knows? Christian Bale may have done an okay job. It's definitely a different take on the Moses story. But anyways, we're now at the point where I believe at this point Moses has left Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says, basically, get out of my sight. This is at the to take away the darkness that is felt, the sort of like beyond just sort of a solar eclipse. It is this darkness that covers the whole land, except for not the land where the Hebrews are. And it's just this penetrating darkness. But the Pharaoh brought Moses and Aaron before him and said, get out of here, get out of my face. If I ever see you again, I swear I will kill you, basically. And yeah, then we get here. Would you like to read the first section, which is 12
Uh,
1 through 13?
12, 1 to 13. Sure. Okay. Sorry, I also have a very needy dog at my side. All right. The Passover. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in Egypt, this month is to be for you the first month of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. You are to determine the amount of lamb needed in accordance with what each person will eat. The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect. You may take them from the sheep or goats. Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the people of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the house where they eat the lambs. That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over a fire, along with some bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or cooked in water, but roasted over a fire, head, legs, and inner parts. Do not leave any of it until morning. Do not leave any of it till morning. If some is left till morning, you must burn it. This is how you are to eat it: with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. We're going to 13.
Yes.
On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both man and animal. I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the house where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt.
All right. So we give the instruction for this sacred meal, first of all, but also a sign for this act of decreation, this plague. This is one of the few things that's actually specifically called a plague. Um, so let's just go through. There's a lot of stuff here. Um, Obviously, this is a very meaningful sort of remembrance and meal, specifically for our Jewish siblings. The Passover meal is eaten every year. There's a lot of sort of ritual and uh, sort of a chance to tell the story, to reenact it, to eat together. That's a part of this. So, um, first thing to note is that we have a brand new calendar. There's an institution of now, instead of using the ways of counting days that would be common for the Egyptian people, or maybe whatever you would had used before, we are now using a totally new calendar. This is now in the first month. This is the first month of your sort of existence as a liberated people. And so that's important. Um, and this begins on the 10th day, which is the seventh plus third day. There's a lot of sort of symbolism there. Seven, as you go into the book of Leviticus, uh, the 7 days of creation, the seven, sevens are vitally important throughout this calendar as there's sort of a um, remembrance of or a rehearsal of God's redemptive work. So that's that's important. And the lambs are to be slaughtered on the 14th day of that month, the 2 times 7 day. Um, the lamb, or it could be a goat, is to be, I think it's really interesting. It's taken into the household, right? So on the 10th day, you're basically adopting this animal and it's a part of your family to a certain extent. And then you slaughter it 3 days later. Um, you made a face when I said that.
Just that's yeah, yeah.
there Yeah. There are some who suggest that part of what is going on here in the institution of Passover and the connection to this firstborn, um, and we'll have that a little bit more explicitly in the second set of reading. Um, but sort of the interpretation is that human sacrifice, specifically of the firstborn, was a common practice among people in the area, including those who followed Adonai. But there is then this sort of switch over, hey, we're not doing that anymore. This is not what God wants us to do. And part of that is this sort of ritual that says, there's this lamb or goat that is to be a um, substitute sacrifice. Going
Mm-hmm.
back to the story of the binding of Isaac, where at that point he's asked to be sacrificed, or God asked for Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, does not do it, or goes to do it and then is stopped. And at that point, a ram is sacrificed um, in as a substitute. Similarly, here we have this lamb or goat that is taken into the household. They become almost one of the children, and then they are sacrificed. So there are some who suggest that that's kind of what's going on here as a narrative. Hey, we don't do this anymore. Instead, we do this other thing. Um, so
And
that's kind of it. Yeah.
no, is that because is that to link it to the story, or a is that because they want to have a direct link to the story of Isaac? Is that why that thought is there? Does that make sense? What I'm asking?
No. Which thought being connected to
Um,
Isaac?
that this sacrifice, that the story of the sacrifice of the goats, that this part is. a direct link to that? Is that the idea?
The
Or
idea is a connection of sacrifice of the firstborn seems to be
okay,
the sort of common thread, and that with both of these stories, there's this narrative, very clear shift away from the actual human sacrifice to a goat or a lamb that is a substitute for what could have been a semi-common practice of either the sacrifice or sort of a ritual. It may not be actual sacrifice, but some sort of um, claiming of the firstborn type thing. That again, we'll see that a little bit more in the next one, but that there may be some of that that's going on of the way that they're telling this particular story is partially also to really sort of hit home this shift in behavior, the shift in ritual, that this
okay.
is something that we used to do. We don't do that anymore. Those of you who might still want to continue to practice this, no, 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 no. Instead, we have this ritual. We have this, like this is a Passover. There is this substitute who dies in our stead. Very much this sort of like that sacrificial system, all of that, and specifically connected to this firstborn stuff that may have happened. Of course, we don't know. Like it's just kind of putting together the pieces, recognizing that Molech, sacrifice of children specifically was a common practice across the area. The narrative is that the Hebrews never did that. It may be some suggest that it's probably that was not something that was a difference at some point, but then it became this distinction that like, hey, we don't do that.
So we don't know. The supposition is, though, because that was something that was done at the time, that most likely it also happened. Interesting.
Because there's this pretty strong narrative like, hey, we don't do this. Things like, in the story of Abram, um, he doesn't bat an eye. God says, well, I want you to do this. And he goes, all right, I'm going to do that. And then there's this very clear, we don't do this. There are a couple of other places where it's sort of like God says, certainly this is not something that I want, or this very clear substitutionary um, move in this Passover story specifically for the firstborn son, uh, that sort of thing. So as we're sort of reconstructing and kind of figuring things out there's some suggestion that that's why this is, the rhetoric is pretty strong
mhm.
in that substitutionary sort of thing. We're shifting now. We're doing something different. Um, that kind of idea.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing that kind of stood out to me is when, bringing something into your home like that, it makes it important. It makes it, you know, again, it's the giving up of something important, something not just, when you give an animal a name, they become part of the family.
Right.
Uh,
And when
you
you're
know,
literally sleeping with it, if
yeah,
it's sharing your household, it's eating from your table. This is, um, I'm thinking of the parable. Oh, it's not a parable. Why? It is a parable. The story that Nathan tells to David
right.
of this man who has a lamb in his household that he treats it like a daughter, and the neighbor sacrifices it. It's sort of like this. Yeah, it's a connection.
Yeah, and then just that again, that idea that like we have to give up something that is important that
Right.
has become part of us.
Mm. Yeah. No, I think that's really important. You also have a lot of this language that we may be familiar with from other conversations around sacrifice, though this is the first time narratively that it comes up, but this idea of something, a lamb without blemish, it's a year old. It blemish could be, uh, it's not lame or have some sort of injury. It's perfectly white, or it might be perfectly black, or it might be, something like that, but it's not kind of speckled or something like that. Which to to that idea of sort of like a preciousness, it's also not, it's making it important that it is sort of the highest value of sacrifices. It's not one that, well, we might as well get rid of Gimpy because he's not going to last that long anyways. It's this is a valuable sacrifice,
Yeah.
meaningful. So they keep it until the 14th day of the month, and then the whole assembly slaughters it at twilight. So this interesting, there's lots of layers, right? So this is your lamb that is for your household, or maybe you share it with a neighbor, depending on how many people we're talking about. But you're in this sort of small community, so there's an individualization, right? Everyone takes in their own lamb or goat. Everyone, this is your sacrifice. This is not something that you bring to the priest, which is interesting, for a sacrifice. There's not one person that makes a sacrifice, which is basically what we see in a lot of the other places. But then they're all to be sacrificed at the same time. There's this common cue of on the 14th day when the sun goes down, now we're all going to sacrifice our animals all at the same time. Um, and that,
Yeah, that's binding of the community together in this act.
mhm. Yeah. So they all do this. And then there's this sacred meal that's to be eaten. Um, Really, it would be the next day because there's the slaughtering of the animal on the 14th, the beginning of the day of the 14th, so sundown. Um, and then,
Wait, the beginning of
yeah,
sundown?
so Hebrew calendar stuff, the day begins at sundown
Oh, interesting.
and then goes on. So that's why things like later when you have, the people want to bury Jesus, it's the day before or not Passover. It's the day before, the Sabbath, before Saturday. So it's Friday, but they have to take him down and entomb him before sundown on the Sabbath.
Okay.
Because yeah, so once the sun goes down, now it's Sabbath. You can't work.
Right.
You can't do anything. Um, so yeah. So anyways, so the next day you have this sacred meal, and this is the Passover. There's the Haggadah, the telling that has sort of formed out of it. This is kind of the beginning of it, but it's a remembrance meal. It's a meal to tell the story of what has happened, and we'll see a little bit more about that. What we have here, um, is a really interesting. Well, let's talk about that in a little bit. Sorry. We got multiple things. So you slaughter, and then you take the blood and you put this on the two doorposts and the lintel of the houses. So the doors themselves are marked with blood
Right.
as this sign. Um, and then you should eat the lamb that same night though you're also supposed to roast it, so it's what we would call the next day, I imagine.
Right. That confused me a little bit, so that makes more sense that
Yeah.
like you slaughter it and then sometime that night you start roasting it so that it's ready for the next
So
meal.
so
Roasting takes a little.
later, yeah. So later in the Gospels, we see things like the day of preparation,
Hmm.
and then the Passover begins. So there's the day of preparation where you slaughter the animals, and then you have the Passover meal. So sundown, you do the thing, you slaughter the animal, and now the next day you're going to have that's where Passover begins with this meal type thing. So they begin to be more and more separated. This sort of day of preparation, and then Passover
Okay.
starts. Um, so you roast it over the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. The Haggadah tells about like the unleavened bread is because of this hastiness, right? You don't have time to let the bread rise. You eat bitter herbs as a reminder of the bitterness of the life in Egypt. But there's also this thing where you're roasting a goat or you're roasting a lamb, which is not exactly a quick process.
Yeah, so
So
that position is really interesting.
yeah, that's what I was going to bring up before. Is there's sort of this sort of you take time to prepare, but then the meal itself is to be hasty, and there's so it's like yeah, a juxtaposition of hasty and also slow. Um, Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
You don't eat it raw, which in general is a good idea. You don't eat it boiled, but roasted over the fire with its heads, legs, and inner organs, which is an interesting one because you
Yeah,
don't
typically that's not.
you no like if you don't want to die, that's not a good, or if you want to die, that's a good thing to follow. Like you would gut the animal. Um, I'm not sure if there's all sorts of conversation around why it says to keep the inner organs in, but they if they're going to eat that animal, they're not going to do that. Um, so um, let none of it remain until the morning. Oh, I was going to show this off, but oh well. Let none of it remain until the morning. I can put that up. Um, and this again would be the morning after. So there's the day of preparation. It's not that you necessarily eat it over that night, but it may be the next day. I'm not sure. Um, I'll have to do some more research on that. Oh yeah, don't let anything remain until the morning. Anything that remains, you burn with the fire. Eat it with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, and eat it hurriedly. And tradition says also reclining. It is the Passover of the Lord. And then we get why is it the Passover? Because God will pass through the land of Egypt and strike down every firstborn in the land of Egypt, from human to animal, and on all of the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Adonai, I am the Lord.
Mhm.
And the blood shall be a sign for you on the house where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. Passover, get it? And no plague shall destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Any other thoughts on that bit?
No, I don't think so. I think I mean, yeah, no, I think the more interesting stuff was about the actual, not more interesting, but more thoughts on the taking it into your own home and um, yeah,
Yeah.
the
And
rest of
of
this is
course,
a familiar part of the story.
And of course, some of this imagery is going to be really, really profound. It's very sort of formational for the Hebrew people, for the sacrificial system, and for us Christians as well. Lots of things here connection. You've got this animal that is a substitutionary
Yeah.
sacrifice. Like you deserve to die, but this animal is taking your place. Its blood is marking you as set apart, um, one for whom this sort of death angel does not come and take the firstborn, or God take the firstborn. There's an interesting, both of those are there. Um, so yeah, those are really important for sort of the sacrificial system in general. And then of course Christianity has taken on that imagery is really important for us in our theology. A sacrificial atonement, right? The one who takes on the sins of many, a firstborn son who is sacrificed, type thing. The blood of the lamb. Um, and as we get into the Gospel of Luke, Luke is very intentional about connecting
Yeah.
um, that the Last Supper, the meal that Jesus and the disciples eat together,
It's the
is
Passover.
well in Luke's gospel, it's specifically on the day of preparation. So it's the day, so it's not actually the Passover meal. In Luke's gospel, it is the meal during which the lamb is sacrificed.
Oh,
And
interesting.
Jesus says, "Hey." So yeah, there's some different gospels kind of have a different time frame
Too.
as to when exactly things happen. And narratively, Luke really connects this day of preparation when the lambs are sacrifices to the Last Supper as sort of this symbolic sacrifice and saying, "Hey, this is my blood, this is my body," and then he is sacrificed.
Yeah.
Um, so some interesting stuff there. Um, and the sort of the idea of being um, given the sign of the lamb covered in the blood, sort of this idea is pretty potent in the Christian
Yeah.
church. All right. So our second reading is from Exodus 13, 1 to 8, a sort of further clarification. The Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me all the firstborn. Whatever is the first to open the womb among the Israelites of human beings and animals is mine." Moses said to the people, "Remember this day on which you came out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, because the Lord brought you out from there by strength of hand. No leavened bread shall be eaten. Today, on the month of Abib, you are going out. When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, which God swore to your ancestors to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you shall keep this observance in this month. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there shall be a festival to the Lord. Unleavened bread shall be eaten for 7 days. No leavened bread shall be seen in your possession, and no leaven shall be seen among you in all your territory. You shall tell your child on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. So we have kind of, again, this institution that this is now going to be not just this one time in Egypt, but this is going to be a regular occurrence. Every year you're to eat this
Yeah.
meal. And specifically, it's a time to remember when you were a part of this, when God came and by strong hand brought you out of the land of Egypt, the land of enslavement. Remember that God is a liberating God that brings us out of enslavement. Um, and when you go to the land that God is going to give you, you keep remembering this. You keep remembering, and I think there's a lot of things there, but initial thoughts on that.
It's interesting that it's now a 7-day festival.
Yeah, so we've got also, and this is we as Westerners don't usually get this, and it also is a bit confused, and these kind of mold together. But in here in Exodus and in Leviticus, there's Passover,
Okay.
which is sacrifice and meal, and then there's the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a 7-day feast
Okay.
in which you eat only unleavened bread, um, and then a great feast at the end of it. So it's a significant kind of period of time, but it's two separate things that are connected to one another.
So it's two separate things, but the so you would have the day of preparation, the Passover feast, then the 7 days of unleavened bread
Yeah.
festival.
Yeah. But then by the time you get to the New Testament, and certainly the modern sort of conception is that there is that these that's Passover, that whole thing.
Whole thing is becomes Passover. Okay.
Day of preparation, Passover, and the unleavened bread is all called Passover.
Okay.
Um,
Do we know kind of when that switch happened or why?
Not really, as far as I know. I can do some
Because
more
it switch
research.
may not be the right word, but just that when the shift happened, I guess.
Yeah, um, it seems to be in that sort of intertestamental period, um, or that after the exile and before the New Testament seems to be this sort of like just conflating of the two. And it's probably not, everything that I've seen is not that it was sort of a specific kind of move away from having a separation to something else, more of just like this whole thing is Passover, right?
Right.
It's just a little bit easier to talk about it that way. And especially as there may have been some periods when they weren't able to do this, um, you know, memory gets a little bit fuzzy and it just kind of gets all combined. And then you have, as it's sort of being translated into Greek culture, into Roman culture to sort of say what this thing is, it becomes easier to just say, no, it's just there's Passover. There are these sort of distinct elements to it, but it's just the season of Passover type thing. Um, becomes a shorthand. So more of sort of cultural drift than it is a specific. Yeah. And it's also, again, to recognize that the point of this is remembrance, specifically remembrance of a God who liberates, a God um, who has brought you out of the land where you were a foreigner and now brought you back to your land. Um, and especially as we, again, sort of the text critical view of how this all came together, is it probably all came together more in our what we understand as this form in that
Mhm.
post exile period. So there's certainly they were doing this kind of thing before. They were telling the story of Exodus, but now as it's coming together and maybe becoming a little bit more formal, telling this story of the Exodus from Egypt in a period where you have actually experienced, or your parents have actually experienced, um, a coming back from exile in Babylon,
Right.
it it takes on even more kind of weight to it, because you're saying God is the God who liberates. We have this ancient story of when God did this in Egypt, and we have this lived story where God did this from Babylon. God is the God who was and who is and is yet to come. The God who is a liberative God. That's really important to this. And that this is to be a story that is passed on. You shall tell your child on this day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. And there's that element, and I love that about the Haggadah, about the story, is it's to be personalized. It's to be claimed. This is when God did this for me. Um, which again, back that sort of, if it's if this is a story of liberation that has been recently experienced from Babylon, it makes it even more kind of, we're telling this story, but we're telling a story of our ancestors, but we're telling a story of ourselves as well. Um,
Um, so the Lord said to Moses, "Consecrate to me every firstborn male, the first offspring of every womb among the Israelites belongs to me, whether man or animal." And then it goes into this the that there's not a whole lot of information there. So how does that play out? What's the
that goes back to that sort of idea that I was talking about of, um, this is one of the reasons why some think that this may be that sort of shift from a literal sacrifice of the firstborn to this more symbolic one. Um,
But what do they like? What's the action that happens there? Is that a ceremonial thing? Is there um like the firstborn of this tribe has this job and the firstborn of this tribe has this job? Like how was that played out then, and how does it play out maybe even in modern? Um,
I'm not sure how it plays out in modern day, though I think that there's probably something similar to it. But later in Leviticus, I think it's in Leviticus. Later in Torah, certainly, it may be in Exodus still. Um, but there's very specific rules and sort of, this is what you do. When you have a firstborn child, if there's a firstborn born among the animals, this is what you do. And there's this whole um, process of redeeming them, which is a really interesting kind of use of that word, right?
yeah.
There's a redemption of the firstborn. So this idea re-cemented, God owns. Like, the firstborn belongs to God. That's sort of like written in the deep magic. This is from the beginning of time. The firstborn belongs to God. There's, again, sort of maybe this cultural understanding that there should be a sacrifice of the firstborn son, but there's this process in which one redeems them. So the firstborn human son is not actually sacrificed, but there's this uh, substitute of an animal. And I think oftentimes the animal would just be sacrificed. Um, but I'll have to do some more research on that specifically. I'll go through real quick and see if I can find it. I think it's in Leviticus.
Not really. Nothing containing yeast. I mean, that some of this is just process that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, it is interesting that this is given to them before they actually enter the land that they're promised, right? When the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, the land swore to your forefathers to give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you are to observe this ceremony. So this is not, okay, now I've done this thing, now do this ceremony. This is a more of a preparation for when that is accomplished.
Yeah. It has an expectation for when this is all fulfilled. Though we also know that celebration of the Passover was pretty important. That's pretty important in the book of Numbers while they're in transit.
I mean, it
Um,
seems like that Passover was celebrated, but the specific Feast of Unleavened Bread
Interesting.
isn't until they've actually entered the land.
Hmm. And an element of that may be that sort of passing on of the information, because at that point they're distant enough from it that there are not people who have living memory of it, and so now we need to continue it on.
Yeah.
All right, so my mistake, it is in Numbers for redemption of the firstborn. Then the Lord said, this is Numbers 3:40. Then the Lord said to Moses, enroll all the firstborn males of the Israelites from a month old and upwards, and count their names. But you shall accept the Levites for me. I am the Lord. As substitutes for all the firstborn among the Israelites and the livestock of the Levites, as substitutes for all the firstborn among the livestock of the Israelites. Um, So the Levites are accepted as substitutes for all the firstborn among the Israelites. And there's a specific price. As the price of redemption for the 273 of the firstborn of the Israelites over and above the number of the Levites, you shall accept 5 shekels apiece, reckoning by the shekel of the sanctuary. A shekel is 20 gerahs. So keep that in mind. Give to Aaron and his sons the money by which the excess number of them is redeemed. So, again, a sort of shift from this firstborn, you have the specific tribe of Levi from which the priests are, from which the priests come, are considered as sort of the firstborns for everybody. And then there's this price that's to be paid of 5 shekels per firstborn. So when you have a firstborn, you give this offering as a recognition.
You give the offering. Okay, but what does that mean were that the Levites stood, like what happened to the Levites?
So it's they belong to God. They are the ones that are set apart, to do the things of God, so that everybody doesn't have to. Um, so they become the priests. They become the people who guard or watch over or build or carry the tabernacle. They're the ones who, um, oversee, they may have flocks of specifically animals that should be sacrificed, but their sort of role in the society and culture is to be the ones who are play that sort of priestly role, or that, yeah, connection to God sort of role. They don't get any land. So all of the other tribes are allotted specific areas, but the Levites don't. They have cities. that are cities of refuge. So if someone is in trouble, if someone is in need, if someone, is wrongfully accused of murder or accidentally kill somebody, they can go to this city of refuge, stuff like that. I'm not sure if I'm answering the question you're asking.
No, but I'm not sure that I'm asking the question properly either. I mean, I guess that kind of answers it because I don't know. There's no way that the number of firstborn Levites is the same as the number of firstborn from all the other tribes. So I get that then the other tribes have to pay,
Right.
but it seems like then the Levites do everything, which like
Well,
why
they
did
do
they have to?
yeah, they do everything for they do all the God stuff. They do all the religious stuff. Um, so that everybody doesn't maybe the idea here is that um, sort of the firstborn is to be given to the um, given to God to play that role, to be priests, to do all those sorts of things. But instead of taking from all the different tribes, this one tribe takes it on for everybody. It's kind of the maybe the idea.
Okay.
But
Yeah,
interestingly enough, their Levi was not the firstborn, so at
yeah,
all.
yeah.
But
That's I think that's part of what I'm struggling with is Levi wasn't the firstborn son. He also wasn't even necessarily the good one. So like why
in fact, very much not. Levi, I think, was responsible for the genocide at Shechem,
yeah,
if I'm not mistaken. And it may be one of those things where,
this is actually not a punishment necessarily, but this is the consequences of those actions is now your family is to serve in this way.
it also may be um, it doesn't make sense because, in part, this narrative is to sort of explain why things are the way that they already are.
Right.
um, that the tribe of Levi is actually in control, whether they were always in control of the temple. They are in control of the temple at this point. And so there's this sort of like,
Backwards a little bit.
yeah, right. We're telling the story backwards, and this is why. And again, back to this sort of like narrative shift away from the sacrifice of the actual sacrifice of firstborns to this sort of like these people are now this sacrificial group. You have all of the imagery. There's so much of all of this sort of theology of chosenness that's a narrowing down that these people, the Hebrews, are chosen among all of the other nations of the world, right? They're set apart, they're holy among those people because they kind of narratively they did not live up to that standard. And so we're going to set apart from among these 12 tribes this one tribe, and they're to be the ones who like understand the things of God. They are set apart, they're holy. Among the Levites, the priests are set apart to specifically be a part, do the things of God. And among all the priests, the high priest is set apart to like, if anybody gets it, like
Right.
hopefully it's somebody gets it. Let's make sure it's this person. And then it's sort of the ways out from that. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest makes sacrifice for all the people. So this one person set apart, um, set apart of the set apart of the set apart of the set apart of the set apart, makes this sacrifice that then affects all of the priests and makes the temple or the tabernacle holy, that sets apart all of the people of Israel, of all the Hebrews, which then is supposed to set apart, and make holy all of the other people, all of the nations. Um, so there's a lot of that sort of stuff that's going on and kind of tied up all in this as well. Um, and it's not a systematic theology, right? It's not someone who's going through and saying, "Oh, well, this all makes sense in this and this and this." It's stories that were kind of saying, "Okay, yeah, we get kind of parts of this, and there's some of this theology that's being developed, and so we have elements of that, and we're kind of shifting away from this, and we're passing it on, and it's multi-leveled, and so it doesn't it doesn't make complete sense, and that's part of the challenge and part of the recognition of Torah that we have, the law, is a selection so we get an idea, but it can't possibly be everything. We don't have all the details. Things like more broadly speaking, if you were to administer sacrifices exactly the way as it's described in Leviticus, the temple would smell all of the time and it would be like rancid constantly because there's kind of some washing, but not really. There's clearly stuff that we're missing. There's clearly, or as our friend Sharon said, the high priest is the only one who gets to go into the temple or into the holy of holies. Well, obviously, except for the cleaning lady who comes in and wipes the blood off of the thing so it doesn't smell. Like there's a lot of stuff that is missing and we just don't know. It's lost to time. How exactly this works, we can guess. And that's basically what we can do is we can make the best guess at given the information that we have, given the sort of tools we have of interpretation and textual critical analysis and archaeology and all of these sorts of things, we're kind of trying to make the most sense.
Yeah.
So if it doesn't make sense, that's
right.
And also, I don't have a PhD in the sacrificial system, so I'm also sort of trying to bring the information that I have, and hopefully I'll be able to do some research this week. And
that was the other thing that kind of stood out to me about this little bit here.
Yeah.
I've got about 5 minutes and then I'm going to need to head out.
Okay, then let's wrap up. So we've read the story of Passover. What are you thinking?
It's like Cain and Abel.
Or I can go first if you want.
Yeah, go ahead. I don't know where I'm going to go with the kids.
Yeah.
So, yeah, tell me what you're thinking and then I'll see if that sparks anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think a good deal of it's going to be kind of what I did last week was tell the broader story of Exodus, and really hone in on the redemption part of it,
Yeah.
that this is the God of liberation who has brought you up out of Egypt, how that is foundational, formational for these people. How telling this story in a post-exile world or in a world in which you are under colonial oppression, the idea of a God who does, and who will liberate, make free, give redemption, which is the first time redemption shows up in Torah is in the Song of Moses or the Song of Miriam, really. Let's give her cred. That this is the God who pays the debt for the person who is enslaved for the purpose of setting them free. And how important that has been for peoples across the world. looking at liberation theology, really claiming and living into this idea of a God who liberates, who hears the cry of the oppressed and the enslaved, and gives them freedom. And part of that is to recognize how we don't hear part of that story because in many ways we are the oppressor. We're the ones who are on top. We're the ones who do have the power. And so to be reminded of what it sounds like to hear this story from the bottom.
Yeah, I think it's hard, I guess, because partly all of that liberation stuff is not as integral to this part of the story that we're actually reading, which is also what I found to be sort of true last week, too. The parts of the story that we were actually reading were not as rich with some of the things I would have probably brought out. So yeah, I mean, I think we'll look at sort of the parallels between this and Jesus. We'll talk a little bit about that, sometimes giving up something that's really important to you, and sort of maybe some of the communal aspect of this, coming together, and working together, and being a part of a community that does this thing. That's probably where we'll go. I will also spend some time reading what somebody else has said might be good for children in this. But that's sort of initially where I'm thinking we'll go. We'll certainly talk about the liberation aspect of it, but maybe more heavily into how the parallels between this and Jesus and that sort of language that we talk about. So yeah, I think that's where we'll go.
Yeah.
So
Sounds good.
yeah.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us again for the Tales of Faith podcast. Like, subscribe, all the stuff. The main thing is on Substack, and that's how you get to the blog that I send out hopefully sometime during the week. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.